George Matthews sat in his small apartment, staring at the wedding invitation in his hands. The golden letters seemed to mock him as he read his own name alongside Camilla's. Tomorrow was supposed to be the happiest day of his life, but something felt terribly wrong. The invitation felt heavier than it should have, weighing down his heart with an unexplainable dread. He had been planning this wedding for 8 months, ever since he proposed to Camilla on that beautiful spring evening in Central Park. She had said yes with tears in her eyes, and he thought those were tears of joy. Now he wondered if there was something else behind them. Camilla Rodriguez had swept into his life like a hurricane 2 years ago. She was everything he thought he wanted: beautiful, confident, and seemingly caring. She worked as a marketing executive at a prestigious firm downtown, and her ambition matched her stunning looks. When she smiled at him across that crowded coffee shop where they first met, George felt like the luckiest man alive. But, lately, things had been different. Camilla had become distant, often coming home late from work with vague explanations about client meetings and deadlines. When he tried to discuss wedding details, she would brush him off or change the subject. Most troubling of all, she had been adamant about keeping the wedding small and private. Just close family, she had insisted when he suggested inviting more friends and extended relatives. "We don't need a big production, George. Simple is better." At first, he had agreed. After all, weddings could be expensive and stressful. But, as the date approached, he began to feel like something was being hidden from him. Camilla's family seemed nice enough during their few meetings, but there was always an undercurrent of tension he couldn't quite identify. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. George glanced at the caller ID and saw his best friend Marcus's name. "Hey, man," Marcus said when George answered. "You ready for tomorrow? Last night of freedom and all that." George forced a laugh. "Yeah, I suppose so. Just going over some last-minute details." "You don't sound very excited for a guy about to marry the woman of his dreams," Marcus observed. "Everything okay?" George hesitated. Marcus had been his friend since college, and he had always been a good judge of character. In fact, Marcus had expressed some concerns about Camilla early in their relationship, though he had kept them mostly to himself after George made it clear he was serious about her. "I don't know, Marcus. Something just feels off. Camilla's been acting strange, and this whole wedding feels rushed somehow. Like she's in a hurry to get it over with. Have you talked to her about it?" "I've tried, but she just says I'm overthinking things. She keeps telling me that pre-wedding jitters are normal." George ran his hand through his dark hair, a habit he'd had since childhood when he was nervous. "Maybe she's right. Maybe I am just overthinking. Or maybe your gut is trying to tell you something," Marcus said gently. "Look, I'm not trying to cause problems, but you deserve to be happy. If something doesn't feel right, you should trust that feeling." After hanging up, George found himself pacing around his apartment. The place felt empty without Camilla, who had insisted on spending the night before the wedding at her own place. "It's traditional," she had said. "The bride and groom shouldn't see each other before the ceremony." George had wanted to protest, to spend their last night as an unmarried couple together, but Camilla had been firm. Now he wished he had insisted. Maybe they could have talked through whatever was bothering him. He walked over to the window and looked out at the city lights twinkling in the darkness. New York never slept, and tonight he felt wide awake despite his exhaustion. Tomorrow, he would become a married man. Tomorrow, his life would change forever. So why did he feel so uncertain? The truth was, there had been signs for weeks that something was wrong. Small things that individually meant nothing but, together painted a troubling picture. Phone calls that Camilla would end abruptly when he walked into the room. Text messages that made her smile in a way that seemed secretive rather than happy. And, then, there was the incident with her phone 2 weeks ago. George had been looking for his charger when he accidentally picked up Camilla's phone instead. As he set it down, a message notification popped up from someone named David. The preview showed only a few words: "Can't wait to see you again." But it was enough to make George's stomach drop. When he had asked Camilla about it later, she had explained that David was a client and the message was about an upcoming business meeting. Her explanation was reasonable, but something in her eyes made him doubt it. She had looked away when she spoke, and her voice had that slightly higher pitch it got when she was nervous. George shook his head, trying to dispel the doubts. Tomorrow was their wedding day. He should be focusing on their future together, not dwelling on uncertainties and fears. Camilla loved him, she had said so countless times. She had agreed to marry him, to spend her life with him. That had to mean something. He moved away from the window and picked up a framed photo from his bookshelf. It showed him and Camilla at the beach last summer, both laughing as a wave crashed behind them. They looked so happy in that moment, so in love. Camilla's dark hair was wet from the ocean, and her eyes sparkled with joy. That was the woman he fell in love with, the woman who had captured his heart completely. But when was the last time he had seen that genuine joy in her eyes? When was the last time she had looked at him the way she was looking at the camera in that photo? The realization hit him like a physical blow he couldn't remember. George set the photo down carefully and walked to his bedroom. Maybe a good night's sleep would clear his head. Maybe in the morning, all these doubts would seem foolish and insignificant. After all, everyone said pre-wedding nerves were completely normal. As he got ready for bed, his mind wandered to his parents. His father had passed away 3 years ago from a heart attack, a loss that still felt fresh and painful. His mother, Eleanor, lived in a nursing home about an hour outside the city. She had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia 2 years ago, and her condition had been slowly deteriorating. George visited her every weekend without fail, and she always asked about Camilla. Eleanor had only met his fiancée a few times, but she seemed to genuinely like her. However, during their last visit, his mother had said something that stuck with him. "She's very beautiful, George," Eleanor had said, looking at a photo of Camilla. "But beauty isn't everything. Make sure she loves you for who you are, not for what you can give her." At the time, George had dismissed the comment as confusion related to his mother's condition. But now, lying in his bed staring at the ceiling, he wondered if there was more clarity in his mother's words than he had realized. Eleanor had always been an excellent judge of character. Even as her memory faded in some areas, her ability to read people seemed to remain sharp. She had loved his father deeply and completely, and their marriage had been a true partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. George had always hoped to find something similar for himself. He thought about calling the nursing home to check on his mother, but it was too late. The staff would be helping residents prepare for bed, and Eleanor would likely be sleeping already. He made a mental note to call her in the morning before the wedding. He wanted to hear her voice, to get her blessing one more time. The hours passed slowly as George tossed and turned. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Camilla's face, but not the loving expression he hoped for. Instead, he remembered the distant look she had worn so often lately, as if her mind was somewhere else entirely. Around 3 in the morning, George gave up on sleep entirely. He got up and made himself a cup of coffee, then sat at his small kitchen table with a notepad and pen. Maybe if he wrote down his feelings, he could make sense of them. He started with the positive things about his relationship with Camilla. She was intelligent and ambitious. She challenged him intellectually and encouraged him to pursue his own goals. She was beautiful, certainly, but more than that, she carried herself with confidence that he found attractive. When they were out together, he felt proud to be with her. But, as he tried to continue the list, George found himself struggling. What else? What were the deeper connections they shared? What were their common interests and values? The realization was uncomfortable, but he had to admit that their relationship was somewhat superficial. They enjoyed going to nice restaurants and attending cultural events together. They both liked traveling and had taken several enjoyable trips. But did they share the same fundamental values? Did they want the same things out of life? George had always assumed they did, but now he realized they had never really discussed their deepest hopes and dreams. They talked about surface things, work, current events, social activities. But when had they last had a meaningful conversation about their fears, their faith, their vision for the future? The more he thought about it, the more George realized how little he truly knew about Camilla's inner world. She was charming and engaging in social situations, but she rarely opened up about her feelings or past experiences. When he tried to dig deeper, she would skillfully redirect the conversation to something else. It was almost as if she was performing a role rather than being herself. But why would she do that? What was she hiding? As dawn began to break outside his window, George felt more confused than ever. In just a few hours, he would be getting dressed for his wedding. Family and friends would be gathering at the small venue Camilla had chosen. The minister would be waiting, the flowers would be arranged, and the photographer would be ready to capture what should be the happiest moments of his life. But, instead of excitement and joy, George felt a growing sense of dread. Something was wrong, he was sure of it now. The question was whether he had the courage to find out what it was, or if he would go through with the wedding and hope for the best. He looked at his phone and considered calling Camilla. Maybe if they talked, really talked, he could put his fears to rest. Maybe she would open up to him and they could work through whatever was bothering him. But, even as he thought about it, George knew Camilla wouldn't appreciate being woken up at dawn on their wedding day. She valued her sleep and her routine, and she would likely be annoyed rather than understanding if he called with his doubts and concerns. That realization was telling in itself. Shouldn't his future wife want to hear from him, especially if he was struggling with something important? Shouldn't she be willing to talk through their concerns together, no matter what time it was? George set his phone down and returned to the window. The city was beginning to wake up, with early commuters heading to work and joggers starting their morning runs. Life was continuing normally for everyone else, but, for him, everything felt suspended in uncertainty. He thought again about his mother and how she had looked at Camilla's photo with such scrutiny. Eleanor had been married to his father for 35 years before his death, and their relationship had been the kind George hoped to emulate. They had been true partners, supporting each other through good times and bad, laughing together, and sharing everything. His father had once told him that the secret to a happy marriage was marrying someone who was also your best friend. You have to genuinely like the person, he had said. Love is important, but like is what gets you through the ordinary moments and the difficult times. Did George like Camilla? The question seemed strange, but the more he considered it, the less certain he became. He was attracted to her, certainly. He was impressed by her success and her beauty. But did he enjoy simply being with her? Did he look forward to quiet moments together? Did he feel comfortable being completely himself around her? The honest answer was troubling. George realized that he often felt like he was trying to impress Camilla rather than simply being with her. He chose his words carefully, dressed in ways he thought she would approve of, and sometimes found himself agreeing with her opinions even when he privately disagreed. That wasn't the foundation for a healthy marriage. That was the foundation for a performance that would eventually exhaust both of them. As the morning light grew stronger, George made a decision. He needed to see Camilla before the wedding. They needed to have an honest conversation about their relationship and their future. If there were problems, it would be better to address them now rather than after they had made legal and spiritual commitments to each other. He showered and dressed quickly, then headed out to his car. Camilla lived in a nicer apartment complex about 20 minutes away, a place she could afford thanks to her successful career. As he drove through the morning traffic, George rehearsed what he wanted to say. But, when he reached Camilla's building and looked up at her apartment window, he saw something that made his heart stop. There was movement inside, shadows of two people where there should only be one. As he watched, frozen with shock, he saw a man's silhouette embrace a woman who was clearly Camilla. George sat in his car for several minutes, trying to process what he had seen. His mind raced with possible explanations, but, deep down, he knew the truth. The doubts that had been plaguing him weren't just pre-wedding nerves. His instincts had been trying to warn him about something real. The question now was what to do with this devastating knowledge. The wedding was set to begin in just a few hours. Guests would be traveling to the venue. His mother would be waiting to hear about the ceremony. Everyone expected him to become a married man today. But, how could he marry someone who was clearly involved with another man? How could he stand at the altar and promise to love and cherish Camilla when she was being dishonest with him about something so fundamental? George started his car with shaking hands and drove away from Camilla's building. He needed time to think, to figure out how to handle this situation with whatever dignity he could muster. His entire future had just collapsed in the span of a few minutes, and he had no idea how to begin rebuilding it. As he drove aimlessly through the city streets, George thought about all the signs he had missed or chosen to ignore. The phone calls, the late nights, the emotional distance, the reluctance to discuss their future in any meaningful detail. It all made sense now, but the knowledge brought no satisfaction, only pain. He pulled into an empty parking lot and sat there as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. Soon, he would have to start making phone calls and having difficult conversations. But, for now, he just sat in silence, mourning the death of the dream that had sustained him for the past 8 months. George sat in his car for nearly an hour, watching the morning traffic increase as people headed to their Saturday activities. His phone had buzzed several times with messages from Marcus and other groomsmen asking about meeting times and last-minute details, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. How do you tell your friends that your wedding is about to become a disaster? Finally, he knew he had to confront Camilla directly. He couldn't go through with the wedding based on assumptions, no matter how convincing the evidence seemed. He owed it to himself and to her to have an honest conversation about what he had seen. George drove back to Camilla's building, his heart pounding as he climbed the stairs to her third-floor apartment. He had a key, but something held him back from using it. Instead, he knocked firmly on the door and waited. When Camilla opened the door, she looked genuinely surprised to see him. She was wearing a silk robe and her hair was tousled, as if she had just gotten out of bed. Her makeup was smeared slightly around her eyes, and there was a flush to her cheeks that could have been from sleep or from something else entirely. "George," she exclaimed, pulling the robe tighter around herself. "What are you doing here? You're not supposed to see me before the wedding. It's bad luck." "We need to talk," George said quietly, studying her face for any sign of guilt or deception. "Can I come in?" Camilla glanced nervously back into her apartment, then stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind her. "Actually, this isn't a good time. I was just about to start getting ready, and my sister is here helping me with my hair and makeup. You know how long that takes." George felt his suspicions deepen. In all the time he had known Camilla, her sister Maria had never been particularly involved in her life. They spoke occasionally but weren't close. Why would she suddenly be there on the wedding morning? "Your sister?" George asked. "I didn't know Maria was coming early to help." "Oh, yes," Camilla said quickly, her voice pitching slightly higher. "She drove up this morning. She wanted to make sure everything was perfect for today." She reached out and touched his arm. "George, you really shouldn't be here. It's going to ruin the surprise when you see me walk down the aisle." But George had already noticed something that made his heart sink. Through the thin door, he could hear movement inside the apartment, but also a distinctly male voice speaking quietly. Unless Maria had suddenly developed a deep baritone, there was definitely a man in Camilla's apartment. "Who's inside with you?" George asked directly, his voice steadier than he felt. Camilla's eyes widened slightly, and he saw panic flash across her features before she quickly composed herself. "I told you, it's just Maria. She's probably on the phone with her boyfriend. You know how she talks." The lie was so obvious that George felt almost insulted by her assumption that he would believe it. He had known Maria for over a year, and her voice was nothing like what he was hearing from inside the apartment. "Camilla," George said, taking a step closer to her. "I need you to be honest with me. Is there someone else?" The question hung in the air between them like a physical presence. George watched as various emotions crossed Camilla's face: surprise, fear, guilt, and, finally, a kind of desperate defiance. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "George, you're being paranoid. This is just pre-wedding stress talking. Let's not do this now, on our wedding day." "Our wedding day," George repeated slowly. "The day we're supposed to promise to be faithful to each other for the rest of our lives. Don't you think honesty is important on a day like that?" Before Camilla could respond, the apartment door opened and a tall, dark-haired man stepped out. He was wearing jeans and a wrinkled dress shirt, and his hair was messed in a way that suggested he had been lying down recently. When he saw George standing there, his face went pale. "Oh," the man said, clearly caught off guard. "I'm sorry, I thought I heard voices." The three of them stood there in an awkward tableau for several seconds. George looked between Camilla and the stranger, noting the guilty expressions on both their faces. There was no innocent explanation for the scene, and they all knew it. "George," Camilla began, her voice weak. "This is David. He's a colleague from work." David, to his credit, at least looked ashamed of the situation. He couldn't quite meet George's eyes as he extended his hand for a handshake that George ignored. "I should probably go," David said quietly. "Camilla, I'll talk to you later." He brushed past them and headed quickly down the stairs, leaving George and Camilla alone in the hallway. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken truths and shattered expectations. "How long?" George asked finally. His voice was remarkably calm, considering that his world was falling apart. Camilla wrapped her arms around herself and looked down at the floor. George, it's not what you think. How long, Camilla? She was quiet for a long moment, and, when she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. But George found that he felt no sympathy for her tears. If anything, they made him angry. She had chosen to hurt him, and now she wanted him to feel sorry for her because she was caught? 6 months, she whispered. But, George, it doesn't change how I feel about you. It was just a mistake that got out of hand. 6 months, George repeated, feeling the full impact of the betrayal. So for half of our engagement, you've been seeing another man. For half the time we've been planning our wedding and our future together, you've been lying to me every single day. It's not that simple, Camilla said, tears flowing more freely now. I never meant for it to happen. David and I worked closely together on a big project, and we spent a lot of time together, and it just happened. Things don't just happen, Camilla. People make choices. You chose to betray me, and you chose to keep lying about it even as we planned our wedding. George felt a strange sense of clarity washing over him. The confusion and doubt he had been feeling for weeks was gone, replaced by a stark understanding of reality. George, please, Camilla reached for his hand, but he pulled away. I love you. I want to marry you. David doesn't mean anything to me, not really. He's just something that happened. But you're the man I want to spend my life with. How can you say that? George asked, genuinely bewildered. How can you claim to love me when you've been sleeping with another man for 6 months? How can you say you want to spend your life with me when you can't even be honest with me? People make mistakes, Camilla said desperately. That doesn't mean our whole relationship is meaningless. We have something real, George. We have a connection. George studied her face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse or understanding of what she had done. What he saw instead was someone who seemed more concerned about losing what she had with him than about the pain she had caused. Do we? He asked. Do we really have a connection, Camilla? Because standing here right now, I feel like I don't know you at all. The woman I thought I was marrying would never do this. The woman I thought I was marrying was honest and faithful and capable of real love. I am capable of real love. Camilla protested. I do love you, George. That's why I was going to end things with David after the wedding. That's why I wanted to go through with today. I was choosing you. The words hit George like a slap. You were going to end things with him after our wedding? So you were planning to cheat on me right up until our honeymoon, and then maybe be faithful after that? Do you hear how that sounds? Camilla seemed to realize how terrible her words sounded, because she backtracked quickly. No, that's not what I meant. I was going to end things before the wedding. I was going to tell him this morning that it was over. While he was spending the night in your bed the night before you married me, George said flatly. That's your idea of ending things? Camilla had no answer for that, and her silence was more damning than any excuse could have been. George turned and walked a few steps away from her, then turned back. I need you to understand something, Camilla. This isn't just about David. This is about who you are as a person. It's about your willingness to lie to someone who loves you, day after day, for months. It's about your ability to look me in the eye and promise me forever when you know you're betraying me. George, please don't do this, Camilla said, her voice breaking. Think about everything we've planned. Think about our future. Think about how good we are together. How good we are together. George almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. Camilla, we were never good together. We were performing being good together. I was trying to be the man I thought you wanted, and you were pretending to be someone you're not. Neither of us was being honest about who we really are or what we really wanted. The truth of his words hit him as he spoke them. Their entire relationship had been built on a foundation of pretense and performance. They had been playing roles rather than being themselves, and it had been doomed from the beginning. That's not true, Camilla protested weakly. We had good times together. We enjoyed each other's company. Did we? George asked. Or did we enjoy the idea of each other? Did we enjoy what other people thought when they saw us together? Because I'm starting to realize that I never felt like I could completely relax and be myself around you. I was always trying to impress you or live up to some standard I thought you had." Camilla was crying harder now, but George found that his own tears had dried up. He felt strangely calm and clear, as if a fog had lifted from his mind. "What happens now?" Camilla asked through her tears. "Are you going to call off the wedding?" George looked at her with something approaching pity. Even now, caught in her lies and betrayal, she was hoping to salvage the wedding. She was hoping he would choose to ignore what he had learned and go through with their plans. "The wedding is already called off," George said gently. "There's no way to come back from this, Camilla. There's no trust left to build on. There's no honesty between us. There's nothing real enough to base a marriage on." "But what will people say?" Camilla asked, and George realized that this might be her primary concern. Not the pain she had caused him, not the destruction of their relationship, but what other people would think. "People will say whatever they're going to say," George replied. "That's not something either of us can control. What we can control is whether we make things worse by going through with a marriage that's built on lies." He pulled his key to her apartment off his keychain and handed it to her. "I'll need some time to figure out how to handle the logistics, canceling the venue, notifying guests, dealing with vendors." "But that's my problem, not yours." "George, wait," Camilla called as he turned to leave. "Can we at least talk about this more? Can we try to work through it? Maybe we could postpone the wedding instead of canceling it completely." George paused on the stairs and looked back at her. She was standing in her doorway in her silk robe, tears streaming down her face, looking absolutely beautiful and completely desperate. 6 months ago, the sight of her tears would have broken his heart and made him want to fix whatever was wrong. Now, he felt nothing but a kind of sad detachment. "There's nothing to work through, Camilla. You made your choice when you decided to start seeing David. You made it again every day for 6 months when you chose to keep lying to me. You made it again last night when you brought him here instead of spending your last night as a single woman thinking about our future together." He continued down the stairs, feeling lighter with each step. Behind him, he could hear Camilla crying, but he didn't look back. There was nothing left to say and nothing left to salvage. When George reached his car, he sat for a moment and called Marcus. "Hey, man," Marcus answered cheerfully. "Please tell me you got some sleep and you're feeling better about today." "Marcus," George said quietly. "The wedding is off." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "What do you mean, off?" "I mean there's not going to be a wedding. Camilla has been seeing someone else for the past 6 months. I just caught them together." "Oh, George," Marcus said, his voice filled with sympathy. "I'm so sorry, man. Are you okay?" "I think I am, actually," George said, surprised to find that it was true. "I think I'm better than I've been in months. I just need to figure out how to handle all the practical stuff now." "Don't worry about that right now," Marcus said firmly. "Where are you?" "I'm coming to get you." "I'm fine, Marcus. I can drive." "Like hell. You just had your world turned upside down. I'm not letting you drive around alone right now." "Where are you?" George gave Marcus his location and sat back to wait. As he did, he realized that for the first time in months, he felt like himself again. The constant anxiety and doubt that had been plaguing him was gone. The feeling that he was performing instead of living had disappeared. It was a terrible way to find clarity, but at least he had found it before making a mistake that would have cost him years of his life. He thought about his mother's words about making sure Camilla loved him for who he was, not what he could give her. Eleanor's wisdom had been right on target, even if George hadn't been ready to hear it at the time. When Marcus arrived 15 minutes later, he took one look at George and pulled him into a bear hug. "I'm sorry, brother," Marcus said. "I'm sorry this happened to you." "Thanks," George said. "But, honestly, I think this might be the best thing that could have happened. Better to find out now than after we were married." Marcus studied his friend's face with concern. "Are you in shock? Because this level of calm is kind of worrying me." George actually smiled for the first time in hours. "I'm not in shock. I'm just relieved, I guess. I've been feeling like something was wrong for weeks, but I kept telling myself I was imagining it. It's almost a relief to know I wasn't crazy." As they drove away from Camilla's neighborhood, George felt like he was leaving behind not just his fiancée, but an entire version of himself that had never been authentic. The man who had been trying so hard to be worthy of Camilla was gone. What remained was someone he recognized and, actually liked, himself. Marcus drove George back to his apartment, where the reality of the situation began to sink in. The living room was scattered with wedding-related items, his tuxedo hanging on the closet door, wedding favors stacked on the coffee table, and a pile of gifts from early arrivals who had dropped them off during the week. "Okay," Marcus said, rolling up his sleeves. "What do we need to do first?" George looked around at the remnants of his wedding day and felt overwhelmed by the logistics of undoing everything they had planned. "I need to call the venue, the caterer, the photographer. God, there are so many people to notify." "Make me a list," Marcus said firmly. "I'll help you call everyone. But, first, we need to deal with the guests who are probably already getting ready to come to the ceremony." George realized with a jolt that it was already past 10 in the morning. The wedding was scheduled for 2 o'clock, which meant guests would start getting ready soon. His cousin Sarah was probably doing her hair, and his elderly uncle Robert was likely putting on the new suit he had bought specifically for the occasion. The thought of disappointing all these people who cared about him was almost worse than dealing with Camilla's betrayal. These were people who had rearranged their schedules, bought gifts, and were genuinely excited to celebrate what they thought would be a happy milestone in his life. "I don't even know what to say to them," George admitted, sinking into his couch. "How do you tell people that your wedding is cancelled because your fiancé was cheating on you?" "You don't have to go into details," Marcus said gently. "You just tell them that circumstances have changed and the wedding has been called off. People will understand that these things happen." George nodded and reached for his phone, but his hands were shaking slightly. The first call needed to be to his mother at the nursing home. Eleanor had been so excited about the wedding, and she had been planning to attend with one of the staff members as her companion. Breaking this news to her would be heartbreaking. He dialed the nursing home's main number and asked to be connected to his mother's room. When Eleanor answered, her voice was bright and cheerful. "George, I was hoping you would call. I'm getting all dressed up for your big day. Nancy is helping me with my hair, and I found that lovely blue dress we bought for the occasion." George's throat tightened at the joy in his mother's voice. "Mom, I need to tell you something important. The wedding has been called off." There was silence on the other end of the line for a long moment. "Called off? What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Camilla and I were not getting married today. There have been some problems that we can't work through." "Oh, George," Eleanor's voice was immediately filled with concern. "What kind of problems? Did you two have a fight?" George hesitated. His mother's memory was inconsistent due to her dementia, and he wasn't sure how much detail to share. But Eleanor had always been someone he could talk to honestly, and even with her condition, she often had valuable insights. "She's been seeing someone else, Mom. 4 months. I found out this morning." "Oh, my dear boy," Eleanor said softly. "I'm so sorry. That must be terribly painful for you." "It is," George admitted. "But I think it's also the right thing. I haven't been happy lately, and I think this explains why." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was clearer and more focused than it had been in months. "George, do you remember what I told you the last time I met Camilla? You said to make sure she loved me for who I am, not what I could give her." "That's right. And I said that because I could see something in her eyes that worried me. She looked at you like you were a prize to be won, not like a man to be loved." George felt tears prick at his eyes. Even with her memory issues, his mother had seen something that he had missed completely. "I wish I had listened to you," George said. "You weren't ready to hear it then," Eleanor replied gently. "Sometimes we have to learn these lessons for ourselves. The important thing is that you found out before you made a commitment you couldn't take back." After promising to visit his mother soon and explaining that she didn't need to worry about coming to the wedding, George hung up feeling both sad and grateful. At least one person in his life had seen the truth about Camilla from the beginning. Marcus had been making coffee in the kitchen and overheard the conversation. "Your mom sounds like a wise woman," he said, handing George a mug. "She is. Even with everything she's dealing with, she still has better judgment than I do." "Don't be so hard on yourself," Marcus said. "You trusted someone you loved. That's not a character flaw, it's what good people do." The problem wasn't with you trusting her, it was with her not being worthy of that trust. Over the next hour, George and Marcus worked through the list of people who needed to be contacted. Each call was difficult in its own way. Some people were shocked, others asked probing questions that George didn't feel like answering, and a few seemed more disappointed about missing a party than concerned about George's well-being. The hardest call was to his cousin Sarah, who had been like a sister to him growing up. She was also the only family member who had really gotten to know Camilla and had expressed enthusiasm about the relationship. "George, what happened?" Sarah asked immediately. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay," George said, and was surprised to realize it was true. Camilla was seeing someone else. "I found out this morning." "Oh my God," Sarah breathed. "I can't believe it. She seems so. I mean, I thought she really cared about you." "I thought so too," George said. "But I think maybe she cared more about the idea of being married than about being married to me specifically." "What do you need?" Sarah asked without hesitation. "Do you want me to come over? Do you need help with anything?" "Marcus is here helping me make calls and figure things out." "But, thank you. It means a lot to know you're there. I'm always here for you, you know that? And, George, I know this probably doesn't help right now, but I think you dodged a bullet. If she could do this to you now, she would have done worse things after you were married." After all the immediate family and close friends had been notified, George tackled the vendors. The venue manager was sympathetic but firm about their cancellation policy. The caterer was understanding and offered to provide the food to a local homeless shelter instead of letting it go to waste. The photographer was disappointed but professional about the situation. The florist was the most difficult conversation. Mrs. Chen had worked for weeks to create the arrangements that Camilla had specifically requested, and she was clearly upset about the financial loss. George promised to pay her in full despite not needing the flowers, which seemed to ease some of her frustration. By early afternoon, George and Marcus had contacted everyone on the essential list. The immediate crisis was handled, but George was left with a strange sense of anticlimax. His wedding day was passing quietly in his apartment, making phone calls and sorting through the debris of his cancelled life. "You know what?" Marcus said, looking at his exhausted friend. "We need to get out of here. Sitting around thinking about everything is just going to make you feel worse." "Where would we go?" George asked. "I don't exactly feel like celebrating." "We don't have to celebrate. But we don't have to sit here wallowing either. Let's go somewhere you actually want to be." "When was the last time you did something just because you wanted to do it, not because Camilla wanted to do it?" The question caught George off guard, because he realized he couldn't remember the last time he had made plans based solely on his own preferences. Everything over the past year had been filtered through what Camilla might enjoy or approve of. "I don't know," George admitted. "Well, think about it. If you had a completely free afternoon with no obligations, what would you want to do?" George considered the question seriously. I think I'd want to go to the museum. The Natural History Museum. I used to go there all the time when I was a kid, but I haven't been in years." "Perfect," Marcus said, standing up. "Let's go look at dinosaurs." As they walked through the museum an hour later, George felt something he hadn't experienced in months: simple pleasure. He wasn't thinking about anyone else's expectations or trying to impress anyone. He was just enjoying the exhibits and remembering why he had loved coming here as a child. "You know," Marcus said as they stood in front of a massive T-Rex skeleton, "you seem more like yourself today than you have in the entire time you've been with Camilla." "What do you mean?" "I mean you're relaxed. You're saying what you actually think instead of filtering everything through what you think someone else wants to hear. You're making jokes. You're just you." George realized that Marcus was right. Even in the midst of what should have been one of the worst days of his life, he felt more authentic than he had in ages. "I think I lost myself somewhere along the way with her," George said thoughtfully. "I was so focused on being the kind of man she would want to marry that I forgot to just be myself." "That's not sustainable in the long run anyway," Marcus pointed out. "Even if she hadn't been cheating, you would have eventually gotten exhausted trying to be someone you're not." They spent the rest of the afternoon at the museum, talking about everything except Camilla and the wedding. For the first time in months, George had a conversation where he felt completely engaged and present. He wasn't wondering what Camilla was doing or whether she would approve of his opinions. He was just talking to his friend about things they both found interesting. As evening approached, Marcus suggested dinner at their favorite pizza place from college, a hole-in-the-wall restaurant that Camilla had always wrinkled her nose at whenever George mentioned it. She always said the atmosphere wasn't very romantic, George said as they sat in a booth with checkered tablecloths and sports memorabilia on the walls. This place isn't supposed to be romantic, Marcus laughed. It's supposed to have great pizza and cold beer and be the kind of place where you can relax and be yourself. George looked around at the familiar surroundings and realized how much he had missed this. He had given up so many simple pleasures to accommodate Camilla's preferences, and he hadn't even consciously realized he was doing it. I think I owe you an apology, George said suddenly. For what? For disappearing on you these past couple of years. For always being busy with Camilla or changing our plans to include her. For becoming someone who was more worried about impressing his girlfriend than maintaining his friendships. Marcus shook his head. You don't owe me an apology for falling in love, George. Even if it turned out to be with the wrong person. That's just part of life. But I changed, George insisted. I became someone I didn't really like, and I let that affect our friendship. You're right, you did change, Marcus agreed. But you're already changing back. Today, even after everything that happened, you're more like the George I've known for 15 years than you've been since you started dating Camilla. As they sat there eating pizza and talking, George's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and saw Camilla's name on the screen. The message read, George, please can we talk? I know I messed up, but I think we can work through this if we really try. I love you and I want to make this right. George showed the message to Marcus, who rolled his eyes. She's persistent, I'll give her that. She doesn't get it, George said, setting his phone aside without responding. She thinks this is about forgiveness and second chances. She doesn't understand that this isn't just about her cheating. It's about who we are as people and whether we're actually compatible. Are you going to respond to her? George thought about it for a moment, then picked up his phone and typed a brief reply, There's nothing to work through, Camilla. I hope you find what you're looking for, but it's not with me. After sending the message, he turned his phone to silent and put it away. Whatever Camilla's response might be, he didn't want to deal with it tonight. So what happens now? Marcus asked. I mean, in the big picture. What do you want to do with your life now that you're not getting married? It was a question George hadn't really considered yet. For so long, his future had been tied up with Camilla's. They had made plans together, talked about where they would live and what their lives would look like. Now he was free to make his own choices, and the possibility was both exciting and overwhelming. I don't know, George admitted. Maybe I'll travel somewhere I've always wanted to go. Maybe I'll take some classes or learn a new skill. Maybe I'll just focus on being a better friend and son for a while. Those all sound like good options, Marcus said. You've got time to figure it out. As they walked back to George's apartment that evening, George realized that despite everything that had happened, he felt hopeful about his future in a way he hadn't in months. The day that was supposed to be the beginning of his married life had instead become the beginning of rediscovering who he really was when he wasn't trying to be someone else. It wasn't the future he had planned, but it might be exactly the future he needed. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding that never happened, and George was beginning to establish new routines in his life. The initial shock and embarrassment had faded, replaced by a quiet sense of relief that grew stronger each day. He had moved past the stage of explaining the situation to people and was now focused on moving forward. On this particular Tuesday morning, George was getting ready for work when his phone rang. The caller ID showed the name of Sunset Manor, his mother's nursing home. His heart immediately jumped with concern, as they typically only called if there was a medical issue or emergency. Mr. Matthews, the voice belonged to Nancy, one of his mother's favorite nurses. I'm calling because your mother has been asking for you quite frequently over the past few days. She seems more agitated than usual, and she keeps saying she needs to tell you something important. George checked his watch. He had been planning to visit Eleanor that weekend, as he did every week without fail, but if she was distressed, he didn't want her to wait. Is she okay physically? George asked, already mentally rearranging his schedule. Physically, she's fine. But you know how her memory comes and goes. Sometimes she's very clear, and other times she's confused about where she is or what year it is. Lately, she's been having more clear moments, but she seems worried about something. George made a decision. I'll come today. I can leave work early and be there by this afternoon. That would be wonderful. I think seeing you will help calm her down. After calling in to work and explaining that he had a family situation to handle, George drove the hour to Sunset Manor. The facility was well maintained and comfortable, with gardens that Eleanor loved to sit in when the weather was nice. George had chosen it carefully after visiting several options, wanting to make sure his mother would be as happy as possible given her condition. When he arrived at Eleanor's room, he found her sitting by the window, looking out at the autumn trees. She was dressed neatly in a blue cardigan and slacks, and her gray hair was styled nicely. On her good days, she still looked like the strong, dignified woman who had raised him. "Mom?" George said softly as he knocked on the open door. Eleanor turned toward him, and her face lit up with recognition and relief. "George! Oh, thank goodness you're here. I've been trying to remember something important, and I was afraid I would forget it again before I could tell you." George kissed her cheek and sat down in the chair beside her. "I'm here now. What did you want to tell me?" Eleanor took his hand and held it tightly. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone her age, and George could see that she was making an effort to stay focused and present. "It's about the girl," Eleanor said urgently. "The one you were going to marry. Camilla." George's stomach tightened. He had told his mother that the wedding was cancelled, but he hadn't gone into detail about why. He had hoped to spare her the more painful aspects of the story. "What about her, Mom?" "I remembered something," Eleanor said, her eyes bright and alert. "Something I should have told you before, but I wasn't sure if my memory was playing tricks on me." George waited patiently. His mother's memories from recent years were often fragmented, but her recollections from the past were usually accurate. "She came to see me," Eleanor continued. "Camilla. About 2 months ago. She came here without you." This was news to George. Camilla had never mentioned visiting his mother alone, and Eleanor had never brought it up during any of his weekly visits. "She came here by herself?" "Yes. She said she wanted to get to know me better before the wedding. She brought flowers and seemed very nice at first." George felt a sense of unease growing in his chest. "What happened?" Eleanor's expression grew troubled. "She started asking me questions about you. About your job and how much money you make. About the life insurance policy your father left you. About whether you owned property or had savings." The unease was quickly turning into something closer to nausea. "What kind of questions exactly?" "She asked if you had talked about buying a house, and how much you could afford. She asked about your father's pension and whether I would be leaving you anything when I'm gone." Eleanor's voice became smaller. "At first, I thought she was just being practical, thinking about your future together. But then..." "Then, what?" "Then, she asked about my condition. About how long the doctors think I have left. She asked if the nursing home was expensive and whether you were paying for it." Eleanor looked directly at George, her eyes clear and sharp. "Son, she wasn't asking because she cared about me. She was asking because she was calculating something." George felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. The picture Eleanor was painting was of someone who was evaluating him as a financial prospect, not as a life partner. "Did she say anything else?" "She asked me not to mention her visit to you. She said it would be a nice surprise if I could tell her things about your childhood and your family that she could bring up later, to show you how much she cared about getting to know your background." George ran his hands through his hair, trying to process this information. "Mom, why didn't you tell me about this before?" Eleanor's face crumpled slightly. "I wasn't sure if I was remembering it correctly. Sometimes my mind plays tricks on me, and I didn't want to cause problems between you and someone you loved based on something I might have imagined." "But you're sure now?" "I'm very sure. When you told me the wedding was cancelled, I felt relieved, and that's when I knew my instincts about her had been right. A mother wants her son to be happy, George. I would never interfere with your happiness unless I was certain something was wrong." George leaned back in his chair, feeling a mixture of anger and gratitude. anger at Camilla for manipulating his mother, and gratitude to Eleanor for her protective instincts, even in the midst of her declining health. "I'm glad you told me," George said finally. "And you were right to be suspicious of her. The wedding was cancelled because she was seeing another man. She'd been lying to me for months." Eleanor squeezed his hand tighter. "I'm sorry you were hurt, sweetheart. But I'm not sorry the wedding didn't happen." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the leaves flutter outside the window. George felt another piece of his relationship with Camilla being recontextualized in light of this new information. Her reluctance to discuss their finances in detail suddenly made sense. Her insistence on a small, private wedding now seemed less about intimacy and more about avoiding scrutiny from family members who might ask uncomfortable questions. "George," Eleanor said thoughtfully, "can I tell you something about love?" "Of course. Your father and I didn't have much money when we got married. We lived in a tiny apartment and ate a lot of beans and rice. But we were happy because we genuinely enjoyed each other's company. We could talk for hours about anything or nothing. We made each other laugh. We wanted the same kind of life." George nodded, remembering the stories his parents had told about their early years together. "Real love isn't about what someone can give you," Eleanor continued. "It's about what you want to give them. It's about wanting to make their life better just because making them happy makes you happy." "Camilla never seemed to want to make my life better," George realized aloud. "She wanted me to fit into her life, but she never showed much interest in adapting to mine." "Exactly. She wanted you to change to suit her, but she wasn't willing to change for you. That's not partnership, that's domination." George thought about all the small ways he had modified his behavior and preferences to accommodate Camilla. The restaurants he had stopped suggesting because she didn't like them. The friends he had seen less often because she found them boring. The hobbies he had gradually abandoned because she thought they were juvenile. "I feel like such an idiot," George said. "How did I not see what she was really like?" "Because you're a good person who assumes other people are also good," Eleanor replied. "That's not something to be ashamed of, sweetheart. It's a quality that will serve you well with the right person." "How do I know when I've found the right person?" Eleanor smiled, and, for a moment, George saw the sharp, wise woman she had been before her illness. "You'll know because being with them will make you feel more like yourself, not less. You'll know because you'll want to tell them about everything that happens to you, good and bad. You'll know because you'll look forward to growing old with them, even when that means dealing with difficult things together." George stayed at the nursing home for another 2 hours, having lunch with his mother and walking with her in the gardens. Eleanor seemed more relaxed and alert than she had in weeks, as if sharing her concerns about Camilla had lifted a weight from her mind. As he was preparing to leave, Eleanor took his hand again. "George, I want you to promise me something." "What's that?" "Promise me you won't let what happened with Camilla make you afraid to trust someone else. The right person is out there for you, but you have to be open to finding her." George kissed his mother's forehead and promised he would keep his heart open to the possibility of real love. During the drive back to the city, George found himself thinking about the patterns in his relationship with Camilla that he had missed at the time. Her interest in his career advancement had seemed supportive, but now he wondered if she was more interested in the potential financial benefits than in his personal fulfillment. Her encouragement to spend money on nice clothes and expensive dinners had felt like she wanted him to look successful, but maybe she was more interested in him appearing wealthy than in him being happy. Even her physical affection had often felt performative rather than genuine. She was always perfectly put together, even in intimate moments, as if she was playing a role rather than simply being present with him. By contrast, George thought about his parents' relationship and the easy affection between them. His father had loved his mother's laugh lines and the way her hair looked in the morning. His mother had loved his father's terrible jokes and the way he hummed while doing dishes. They had seen each other at their most ordinary and found beauty in those everyday moments. George realized he had never had that kind of comfortable intimacy with Camilla. He had always felt like he was performing for her approval rather than simply being accepted for who he was. When he got back to his apartment, George found himself looking at his space with new eyes. Over the past few weeks, he had been gradually removing traces of Camilla and their relationship. But now he started thinking about what he actually wanted his life to look like, not just what he wanted to forget. He pulled out a notebook and started making lists, not of things to do or problems to solve, but of things that brought him genuine joy. Time with friends and family. reading books that challenged his thinking, trying new foods and exploring different neighborhoods in the city, learning new skills just for the pleasure of learning them. For the first time in years, George was making plans based solely on his own interests and values. It was simultaneously liberating and slightly terrifying to have so much freedom to choose his own direction. His phone buzzed with a text message, and he glanced at it expecting to see Marcus checking in on him. Instead, he saw Camilla's name again. The message read, "George, I've been thinking a lot about what happened between us. I know I made mistakes, but I think we could work through them if we went to couples counseling together. We were good together most of the time. Don't throw that away over one mistake." George stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Camilla still didn't understand that this wasn't about forgiveness or second chances. This was about fundamental compatibility and honesty, qualities that couldn't be created through counseling if they didn't exist naturally. He thought about what his mother had said about the right person making him feel more like himself rather than less. With Camilla, he had constantly felt like he was trying to live up to some standard or expectation. With the right person, he should feel accepted and appreciated for exactly who he was. George looked around his apartment and realized that for the first time in months, he felt completely at peace in his own space. There was no one he needed to impress, no image he needed to maintain, no performance he needed to give. He could simply be himself, and that felt like the best possible foundation for whatever came next in his life. 2 months had passed since George's conversation with his mother at Sunset Manor, and life had settled into a new rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. He had thrown himself into work, reconnected with old friends, and even started taking evening art classes at the community college, something he had always wanted to do but had never found time for when his schedule revolved around Camilla's preferences. On this crisp November afternoon, George was leaving his office when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Sunset Manor again, and his heart immediately clenched with worry. These calls had become more frequent lately, as Eleanor's condition had been deteriorating more rapidly over the past month. "Mr. Matthews?" It was Nancy again, but her voice sounded different this time, gentler, more careful. "I think you should come as soon as you can. Your mother has taken a turn for the worse." George's hands went cold. "How bad is it?" "She's stable right now, but she's been asking for you constantly. The doctor would like to speak with you about her condition and what we should expect going forward." "I'll be there within the hour," George said, already heading toward his car. The drive to Sunset Manor felt longer than usual, with George's mind racing through all the conversations he wished he had had with his mother while she was still completely lucid. He called Marcus to let him know what was happening, then focused on the road and tried to prepare himself for what he might find when he arrived. Nancy met him at the front desk with a compassionate smile. "She's been having a difficult day, but she perked up about an hour ago and said she knew you were coming." Sometimes they have that intuition. George nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had known this day would come eventually, but knowing something intellectually and facing it emotionally were entirely different experiences. Eleanor's room was dimmer than usual, with the curtains partially drawn to reduce the harsh afternoon sunlight. She was lying in bed, looking smaller and more fragile than George had ever seen her. But when she heard his footsteps, she opened her eyes and smiled with recognition. "There's my boy," she said softly. Her voice was weaker than it had been during their last visit, but her eyes were alert and focused. George sat down beside her bed and took her hand. Her skin felt paper thin, but her grip was still warm and comforting. "How are you feeling, Mom?" "Like I'm getting ready for a long journey," Eleanor said with a slight smile. "But I'm glad you're here. I've been waiting to tell you something important." George squeezed her hand gently. "I'm listening." Eleanor took a shallow breath and seemed to gather her strength. "I want you to know how proud I am of you. Not just for your job or your achievements, but for the man you've become. You have your father's kindness and integrity, and those are the qualities that will serve you best in life." "Mom, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," Eleanor interrupted with a flash of her old firmness. "I need to say these things while I still can. You handled that situation with Camilla with such grace and wisdom. You could have been bitter or vengeful, but instead, you chose to learn from it and move forward. That shows real character." George felt tears starting to form in his eyes. "I learned that from you and Dad. You always taught me to treat people with respect, even when they don't deserve it. Your father would be so proud of the man you've become, Eleanor continued. And, I want you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me you won't let fear keep you from finding real love. What happened with Camilla was painful, but it wasn't real love. When you find the genuine thing, you'll know the difference, and it will be worth all the risk. George nodded, not sure he could speak without his voice breaking. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. There's something else. I've been thinking about Kate. George was confused for a moment. Kate who? Kate Morrison. Do you remember her? She was in your class in high school. Her family lived 3 houses down from us. George did remember Kate, though he hadn't thought about her in years. She had been a quiet, thoughtful girl with auburn hair and green eyes who was always reading books and volunteering for various causes. They had been friends but not particularly close, moving in different social circles. I remember her. Why are you thinking about Kate? Eleanor smiled mysteriously. She came to see me last week. Kate came to see you? Why? She moved back to town recently to take care of her father, who's been ill. She heard about your wedding being cancelled through mutual friends, and she wanted to make sure you were okay. She was always such a thoughtful girl. George was surprised by this information. He hadn't spoken to Kate since high school graduation, and they had never been more than casual friends. That was nice of her to check on me, but why did she come to you instead of contacting me directly? Because she didn't want to intrude if you were going through a difficult time, Eleanor explained. She just wanted to know if you had family support and if there was anything you might need. George found himself touched by this gesture from someone he barely knew anymore. In contrast to Camilla's calculating visit to his mother, Kate's concern seemed genuinely caring and unselfish. She's become a teacher, Eleanor continued. Elementary school. And she volunteers at the animal shelter on weekends. She told me about the books she's been reading lately and the garden she's trying to start at her father's house. George could see where this conversation was heading, and he felt a mixture of amusement and exasperation. Mom, are you trying to set me up with Kate Morrison? Eleanor's eyes twinkled with mischief. I'm just telling you about a lovely girl who is concerned about your well-being. What you do with that information is up to you. Despite everything, George found himself smiling. Even facing her own mortality, his mother was still trying to look out for his happiness. She left her phone number, Eleanor added casually. In case you ever wanted to thank her for checking on you. Of course she did. It's in my address book on the nightstand. The blue one. George shook his head with affection. You're incorrigible. They spent the next hour talking about happier memories, vacations they had taken as a family, holidays spent together, and stories about George's father that never got old no matter how many times they were told. Eleanor seemed to gain energy from reminiscing, and, for a while, George could almost forget how frail she had become. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor grew tired and dozed off several times. During one of these quiet periods, George found himself thinking about Kate Morrison and what his mother had told him. He remembered Kate as being kind and intelligent, with a dry sense of humor that often caught people by surprise. She had been one of those people who seemed genuinely interested in others rather than focused on herself. When Eleanor woke up again, she looked directly at George with an expression of urgent clarity. George, I need you to understand something. When I'm gone, I want you to live your life fully. Don't spend years mourning me or feeling guilty about moving on. Find someone who makes you happy, build a family if that's what you want, and create new memories that are just yours. Mom. I've had a wonderful life. I was married to a man I adored, I raised a son I'm proud of, and I've seen you grow into someone I genuinely like as a person, not just love as a mother. I'm not afraid of what comes next, and I don't want you to be afraid of what comes next for you either. That evening, George had dinner with Eleanor in her room, feeding her small bites of soup when she became too tired to manage the spoon herself. They watched an old movie together, one of the romantic comedies from the 1940s that she had always loved, and Eleanor fell asleep during the final scenes. George stayed until visiting hours were over, holding his mother's hand and listening to her peaceful breathing. When he finally had to leave, he kissed her forehead and whispered that he loved her. I love you too, sweetheart, Eleanor murmured without opening her eyes. Don't forget about Kate. George drove home slowly, processing the conversations of the day and trying to prepare himself for what he knew was coming. His mother was dying, and, while that knowledge was heartbreaking, he was grateful for the time they had had to say the things that mattered most. When he got back to his apartment, George found himself looking through old photo albums and remembering the life his parents had built together. They had faced financial struggles, health scares, and family challenges, but they had faced them as a team. They had genuinely enjoyed each other's company, even during ordinary moments like grocery shopping or watching television. That was what George wanted for himself, not the performance and pretense he had shared with Camilla, but the real partnership and companionship his parents had modeled. Almost without thinking, George found himself reaching for the phone number his mother had mentioned. Kate Morrison's contact information was written in Eleanor's careful handwriting on a small piece of paper tucked into her address book. George stared at the number for several minutes, debating whether to call. What would he say? How do you reach out to someone you haven't spoken to in over a decade to thank them for checking on your welfare through your sick mother? Finally, he decided to send a text message instead. It seemed less intrusive than a phone call, and it would give Kate the option to respond or not without pressure. Hi Kate, this is George Matthews from high school. My mother told me you stopped by to check on me recently. That was very thoughtful of you, and I wanted to thank you. He sent the message before he could second-guess himself, then set his phone aside and tried to focus on other things. About an hour later, his phone buzzed with a response. George. I hope you don't mind that I visited your mother. I heard about your wedding situation and wanted to make sure you had support. I remember how close you two always were. George smiled at the message. Kate's concern was exactly the kind of genuine caring his mother had been talking about. He typed back, I don't mind at all. It means a lot that you thought of me. How is your father doing? What followed was a gentle, easy conversation via text that stretched over several hours. Kate told him about moving back home to help care for her father, who was recovering from a stroke. She talked about her job teaching third grade and her struggles to convince her father to eat vegetables. George found himself laughing at her stories and sharing details about his own life that he hadn't talked about with anyone except Marcus. There was something comfortable and natural about communicating with Kate that reminded George of conversations with old friends, easy, unforced, and genuinely interesting. She asked thoughtful questions and seemed to actually listen to his answers, rather than waiting for her turn to speak. As the evening wore on, George realized he was looking forward to each new message from Kate in a way that felt completely different from his relationship with Camilla. There was no anxiety about saying the wrong thing, no need to impress her, and no sense that he was being evaluated or judged. When they eventually said goodnight, George felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the simple pleasure of connecting with someone who seemed to genuinely like him for exactly who he was. The next morning, George woke to a call from Sunset Manor. Eleanor had passed away peacefully in her sleep.